Chapter 5. Hypermib, Weird Body Tricks. Look what I can do, Ernest exclaimed during math. He cracked all 10 of his knuckles. That's nothing, said Calvin. Watch this. He popped his thumbs out of joint. I've got you both beat, said Bernadette. She bent the fingers of her left hand all the way back until they touched her wrist. Mr. Jupiter put down his protractor. Those are all excellent examples of hypermobility, he said. Hyper, huh? Asked Cam. Hypermobility, translated Stanford with a superior sniff. It means having joints that stretch further than normal. You mean like this? Asked Cam. He bent his arm back behind his back and reached up to his ear. Precisely, said Mr. Jupiter. Can you do this? Asked Jackie. She touched the tip of her tongue to the tip of her nose. Tongues wagged, but no one could. Or this? Asked Jackie. She touched the tip of her tongue to the point of her chin. More wagging, but still no one could. Or this? She leaned forward and licked her own elbow. Tongues around the room came up short. Jackie raised her arms in victory. The winner and the 5th grade Hypermib, Weird Body Trick champion is, she cried, Jackie Jumpba! She made the sound of a roaring crowd. Big deal, said Lenny. Even my dog can lick his own nose. And the other end, too, added Bruce. The two boys woofed and panted. Mongrels, said Victoria. She stuck out her tongue and then folded it in half. Whoa, exclaimed Ernest. Did you see that? Everyone turned to Victoria. Do it again, urged Ernest. Victoria did. Then she twisted her tongue into a basket shape, a clover shape, and then she rolled it up like carpet. Who's a champion now? She asked. Said Rachel. She stomped her foot for attention. The class looked at her. Said Rachel, and she moved her eyeballs back and forth, faster and faster and faster until... Remarkable, commented Mr. Jupiter. Rachel's eyeballs were shaking around in her head like a washing machine on a spin cycle. The room erupted into a frenzy of weird body tricks as the 5th graders tried to outdo each other. Noses twitched, joints popped, skin stretched, eyes crossed, fingers tangled. Ashley Z burped the alphabet. At last, said Mr. Jupiter, nodding at the boys, and it was worth the wait. Now the 5th graders hollered at one another. Try this! Can you do this? Watch me! Only Melvin remained in his seat. He silently watched his classmates with a bemused look on his face. For the first time, Calvin noticed him. What's the matter with you? Calvin asked. Don't you know any tricks? I know some, said Melvin. They must not be any good if you're not showing them off, said Calvin. Melvin shrugged. They're okay. The others noticed Melvin too. I bet yours are nothing compared to my knuckle trick, said Ernest. Or my tongue trick, said Victoria. Mr. Jupiter turned to Melvin and nodding encouragingly said, Share with us, he said. Okay, if you really want me to, said Melvin. He pushed off his shoes, stripped off his socks, and padded barefoot to the front of the room. The class stopped and watched as Melvin sneezed, but his eyes stayed open. That's it, said Calvin. That's your trick? There's more, replied Melvin. Plucking a kazoo off Mr. Jupiter's desk, he played America the Beautiful. As he did, he raised his eyebrows, first the left one, then the right one, then the left, and then the right. Left, right, left, right. His eyebrows kept time to the song's beat. Interesting, admitted Calvin. There's more, said Melvin. Dropping the kazoo back on the desk, he sat down on the floor. Then he bent his left index finger all the way back to his wrist. He crooked his left arm all the way behind his back. He wrapped his left leg behind his neck, tucked his elbow behind his knee, and let his left foot dangle over his right shoulder. Eyes wide, Bernadette pulled out her reporter's notebook. "I don't believe it," exclaimed Calvin. "There's more," said Melvin. This time he bent his right index finger all the way back to his wrist. He crooked his right arm all the way behind his back. He wrapped his right leg behind his neck, tucked his elbow behind his knee, and let his right foot dangle over his left shoulder. Emberly, who had spent his summer reading the entire McFarty Boys mystery series, pulled out his magnifying glass for a closer look. "He is a human pretzel," declared Calvin. "There's more," said Melvin. Rolling head over elbow down the aisle, he pushed up his desk lid with his head and fished around until he pulled out his lunch bag with his teeth. Then, using his bare toes, he unwrapped the straw from his juice box. For several seconds, all anyone could see were his lips and his cheeks moving, and as he sucked the juice into his mouth. Then, ta-da! Melvin stuck out his tongue. On the tip of his tongue was the straw, and it was tied in a knot. "Shh! He tied a knot with his tongue!" shouted Calvin. The classroom exploded into whistles and cheers and applause. Even Mr. Jupiter whooped. I haven't seen anything that extraordinary since my traveling days with those two famous Venetian contortionists, the tumbling Twistalones." Melvin unfolded himself. "It was nothing," he said with a blush. "Nothing?" repeated Humphrey. "Why, you're a genius, a master," cried Calvin. "Geez, you should have told us that you could do all that years ago. We would have noticed you back in first grade." Remember, they always ignored him because he never spoke up. The others nodded in agreement. Then Jackie pretended she was talking into a microphone. "Here he is, sports fans, the 5th grade Hypermib, Weird Body Trick Champion, Melvin Moody." She made the sound of a roaring crowd. "Gee, thanks," said Melvin as he sat back down at his desk, and he put his shoes and his socks back on. The moral of this chapter is, he who does a thing well does not have to boast. Think about what that means, and we'll talk about that moral tomorrow. He who does a thing well does not have to boast.